associate at public affairs firm called Morgan Hollingworth.
At some point, did you live up in this area?
I did.
When was it that you moved down to California?
I moved to California from Seattle. Is that what you just asked me?
Yes.
2010.
And at some point when you were up in this area, did you work at Bally's Gym?
I did.
Which Bally's Gym did you work at?
When I first relocated to Seattle from Detroit, I began my career at the Everett LA Total Fitness, and then subsequently after that worked at almost every single one of the 14 clubs.
Did you know Dave Pietz?
I did.
And where did you know him at?
I knew him, I first met him at the Everett Club.
And did he actually hire you?
He did.
What was his job at the gym when you got hired?
He was the general manager.
And what did you get hired as?
I was originally hired as a front desk associate, and I began by opening the club and working the opening shift.
And do you recall what year it was you began working at Bally's?
I believe it was either the end of 2003, beginning of 2004.
And did you ever meet or get to know his wife, Nicole?
I did.
How did that come about?
I became friends with the sales manager, Luke Wagner's fiance, Bridget Beckler at the time, who was really good friends with Nikki. And there was another sales associate, Eileen Flores, and we all began working out together on a consistent basis and going to lunch, shopping, just typical girl things.
So do I understand that Nicole would actually come into the gym and work out, and that's how you first met her?
Yes.
Okay. How often do you think Nicole would come to the gym and work out at the same time you were there?
At least, I would say, a minimum of 4 days a week. She was very consistent about her workout.
And did you actually, when you weren't working, work out with her as well?
I would.
Was that also frequent?
As much as I could based on my work schedule. And it was typically Bridget and Nikki and I, and sometimes Eileen would work out with us.
And you talked about also socializing outside of the club, the gym. How often did you and Nicole, either yourselves or with other people, do stuff outside the gym?
Once a week, maybe more. Sometimes we would go to lunch after we worked out, usually on the weekends.
Did you end up developing a pretty close friendship with her?
I started to, yes.
Did you ever socialize with the defendant, David Pietz, outside the club, or was that all work?
I never socialized with him outside the work, but definitely in the workplace. I worked with him closely every single day.
Did you consider yourself friends with both the defendant and Nicole?
I would describe my relationship with Dave as being more professional rather than a friendship. We really tried to maintain professionalism at work, but I definitely socialized and was more maybe gravitated to having a closer relationship with Nikki.
During the time that you knew Nikki and would spend time with her, were you able to form an opinion based on things you observed about whether you thought she had some insecurities?
I did, just based on conversations that you would have with your girlfriends in the locker room or while you were working out on the workout floor, just by things that she would ask me as far as if I thought she needed to lose weight, or she would kind of talk about things about her body she wasn't happy with, or if I thought she was pretty enough.
If she was pretty enough?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And was it your impression that was coming from concerns about her husband or just general concerns?
In the beginning, I thought it was just typical female, but then as it progressed and the more I was spending time with both her and Bridget, it became clear that she was feeling really insecure with, I would say, her marriage and wanting to...
Objection Foundation.
Counsel.
Let me ask a couple of questions additional. Are there times when you would get to see her more around her husband?
Every time she came to work out, and until I clocked out to work out with her.
And so when you were starting to talk about whether you thought her insecurities were related to her husband, did that come from how you observed her around him or him around her?
She's very sensitive to the needs of those around her, especially Dave. She wanted very much to please him and for him to be happy.
Foundation.
I'll overrule that. I think it falls within intent, state of mind.
You said she very much wanted to please him.
Yes.
Can you give examples of what you would see that would make you think that?
Just very attentive, bringing him lunch, being sweet, tender, very accommodating as far as what he was wanting to do with his schedule, and not wanting to be upset or not wanting to say no to him.
Was there a time that you became aware that he started wanting to go out more and sort of be more of a partier?
I would say towards like the end of 2004, there was a group of people at the Everett Valley that I knew were going out after hours and hanging out in various places. In the beginning, Nikki never went with them. In fact, it was hard for her because she was trying so hard to maintain her sobriety, and she was trying to fill her schedule with things that didn't involve being around alcohol or drugs.
And so she would choose not to go but let him go?
Correct.
And did you see if that upset her?
She made some comments to me that yes, it was upsetting to her if she wanted to be there.
I think it goes to state of mind, how she's expressing, she's feeling about it.
I agree. Any state of mind testing.
Can you just indicate what she was expressing about her feelings when he would go out and she couldn't go?
That she felt left out and wanted to be with him, but it wasn't a good choice for her to be around that situation.
Now,
Just a second. All right, go ahead.
you said that you were talking about her being very attentive to him, bringing him lunch, very sensitive to his needs. Now, people might say, well, that's what a good wife would do or a good husband would do. Is there something that makes you think that was over the top? What did you see that makes you think that was her being insecure?
I have a lot of girlfriends, and they didn't always call the club incessantly to speak to their husband. I mean, my friend Bridget, her husband worked there. Nikki would call the club frequently, almost to the point where it was interrupting, our ability to operate the front desk. Coming in, asking questions. Every time I hired a new front desk associate or retail associate, she would ask if she had anything to worry about. Those positions tended to attract young women with social, very gregarious, passionate about health and fitness, and so that's where the industry that we were in, and so we had really attractive people working there.
So was there a lot of turnover at the front desk such that she would always call you when someone new was there?
Yes. Mostly because we didn't pay a very good hourly rate.
Fair enough. So she would call about that. You said she would call the club all the time, almost to the point that it was a distraction. Was she wanting to talk to the defendant, or was she wanting to ask what was going on with the defendant?
She would call to speak with him, but if he wasn't available or on tour, then she would ask where he was and what he was doing. Almost trying to say, is he really in the club on tour, or is he somewhere else?
And would you tell her? Would you always answer and say what he was doing?
I would if I answered the phone. And the other front desk associates, I believe, yes. Typically he was always doing what he said he was doing.
Would you, when she would call concerned about a new receptionist who'd been hired, would you try to reassure her?
I would, because I thought it was odd because the way that she asked it, it was almost like she didn't want me to think that she was checking up, but it was evident that she was worried, she was concerned.
Did she give the impression to everybody that her marriage was good?
Yes, she did.
Did you question that based on all of her calls?
Sometimes when we would have just female conversations, she was very wanting people to think that they had a very good marriage, that they, very handsome couple and articulate, charismatic. She didn't like to talk about problems that they were having and the things that...
Yeah, I'm going to object on foundation.
Overruled.
Go ahead, you can just finish your answer. If there's anything more you have to add.
no, that's it.
what were your observations of the defendant in terms of him? Was he insecure? Was he not insecure? How did you observe him to be in terms of his just manner at the club?
I would describe Dave as being an alpha male, as being very charismatic, intelligent, smart. He was consistently one of our top performers at Valley. That's why he was in the position that he was in. He was very good at his job.
I take it from your testimony that Nicole would obviously, and without getting into what she would say, it sounds like she would talk to you about her feelings, her marriage, things like that. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Did the defendant do the same with you, or did you not have that kind of relationship with him?
He never confided in me about anything about Nikki. He was always very professional with me.
Now, at some point, did the defendant leave Bally's?
Yes.
After that happened, did you stay in touch, or were you able to stay in touch with the defendant or Nicole at that point?
I stayed in touch with Nikki for a very brief time after that, and then I lost touch with both of them.
Do you recall approximately when that was that the defendant stopped working at Bally's?
2005, I believe.
At some point, did you become aware that she had gone missing?
I did. I was actually working at the Bellevue Club, and they have TV monitors above the front desk, and it was on the news. And then obviously the phone lines were going crazy.
And did you then attend Nicole's funeral later?
I did.
Thank you, Ms. Lucy. I don't have any other questions for you right now.
With David and Nicole, this was back in 2003, 2004, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And the comments that Nicole made to you about her body and so forth, this was made to you at the gym?
Correct.
And this would be when you and Nicole were working out together at the gym?
Yes. Or at lunch.
Okay. I don't have any other questions, Your Honor.
Just one brief clarification. You said you thought the defendant left Bally's in 2005, so did you continue to have some contact with him in 2005? If that's when he left?
I did not after he left, no.
Right. If he left in 2005, though, did you continue to have contact, excuse me, up to the point that he left?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't have anything else for you.
Anything else, Ken?
Well, but you first became acquainted with them in 2003, is that correct?
It was either the end of 2003 or the beginning of 2004.
Okay. All right, nothing further, Your Honor.
Anything else? You may step down to excuse. Come forward, sir. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm your testimony in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Be seated.
Thank you.
Tell us your name and spell your last name.
Anthony McNabb, McNabb.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a sergeant with the King County Sheriff's Office.
How long have you been with the King County Sheriff's Office?
Over 25 years now.
Okay. What are your duties involved there?
Various duties. I was patrol for the majority of the time. Detectives 1 year, joined the Green River investigation, worked that for about 5. Got folded into major crimes for a couple of years, and then I got promoted to sergeant.
Okay, what is major crimes? What does that unit do?
We investigate felony assaults, robberies, homicides.
So as a sergeant in major crimes, you supervise detectives that investigate homicide. Let me start over. As a sergeant in major crimes, you supervise detectives who work on homicides.
Yes, I do.
In 2006, what was your position in major crimes?
At that time, I was still a detective officially with the Green River investigation, but I was working alongside major crimes.
And were you involved in the investigation into the death of Nicole Pietz?
Yes, I was.
At some point, did you become deeply involved as an investigating detective in that case?
Yes, I did.
I'd like to direct your attention to February 6, 2006. We had testimony yesterday about the discovery of Nicole's body. Do you remember that day?
Yes.
Where and how did you come to be there? How did you end up at the scene?
Sergeant Gates, who was one of the sergeants of Major Crimes Unit, called me and asked me to respond to the scene.
Okay, and where was it located?
The address was approximately the 1010 South 144th Street.
Okay. Are you familiar with the area as it looked that day? Do you remember what it looked like?
Yes.
And I want to show you a couple of diagrams that we looked at yesterday. Can you first of all tell us what the MAR unit is in King County?
It's the Major Accident Response and Reconstruction Unit. Basically, they handle major accidents that results in death or serious injury.
Okay. And do you use them in homicide investigations?
Yes, we use them.
In what capacity?
They come out and they use their total station, which helps diagram the scene, and they make an accurate representation or sketch of the scene.
What's a total station?
It's a device that shoots out a beam. So they have two people, one on either end. One shoots out the beam, the other one's holding the pole on a mark, and it measures the distance from the center point,
Okay.
or from where the total station is.
So what's the point of having them there?
It gives you a two-scale diagram of what the scene looks like.
Okay. I'm showing you what's been marked, or actually entered for illustrative purposes, states 22 and 23. Have you seen those before?
I have not seen those diagrams.
Okay. I'd like you to take a look first at 22. And remembering what the scene looked like when you were there, tell us if that's an accurate representation of what you remember from the scene.
Yes, it is.
And I'm going to hand you state 23, which is a more close-up view. Is that an accurate representation of what you remember from the scene?
Yes.
Turn it off with these as substantive evidence at this point.
No objection.
Detective, I'd like to show you a few photographs of the scene so we can sort of get an orientation as it relates to the diagram. And I'm going to hand you,
States Exhibit 32 has been marked.
I'm going to hand you States Exhibit 32. Can you review those and tell us if you recognize them?
Yes.
How do you recognize them?
It was the scene where we recovered her body.
Okay, are those accurate depictions of parts of the scene to sort of give us an overview of the area?
Yes.
Okay, offer States 32.
No objection.
You can hang on. Now, I guess, sure. I actually have an extra copy for the court, Your Honor. Detective Pavlovich, I borrow you for a minute. I'm just going to have you hold the diagram up to the side of this television screen, if you would, please. Okay, I'm going to put photo A up on the screen. Okay, it's a little dark. is that seeable, or can I have permission to lower the lights a little bit? Thank you. That might help.
You got something up on the screen now?
I do. It's a little dark, and is
that all right?
better? Okay. Okay, Sergeant McNabb, if you would step down and show us relative to the diagram that Detective Pavlovich is holding, where are we looking in that picture?
Looking up in this direction.
Okay, so you're pointing to the upper right of the cul-de-sac?
Yes, that would be,
Okay.
yeah, northeast.
Okay, now that area, we had some testimony yesterday from Deputy Keller about it being a heavily wooded area. Is that your recollection of it as well?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to show you photograph B. What does that show?
It's looking almost directly up.
Straight up
Yes.
from the cul-de-sac. And what is the yellow pole and the guy in yellow?
That's one of our major accident and response detectives, and that's the total station that he's holding.
Okay,
So that would be the reference point in the diagram there, marked with the plus sign.
Okay, so that's where they start shooting the beam and taking measurements?
Yes.
Okay. What are we looking at in photograph C?
Again, you're looking up kind of a little bit to the left.
Okay, and so for purposes of the record, you're pointing to straight above the cul-de-sac and a little to the left?
Yes.
Okay, and who's that group of people, do you know? You don't have to name them, but,
There's some detectives there, a couple from Snohomish County and a couple of ours.
okay. Now, you can see on the diagram, there's a little black dot at the top,
Yes.
and we heard testimony yesterday that was to represent the location of Nicole's body. Where would that be relative to the picture in number C?
I think it's right behind them, right in there.
Okay, up on that area.
Yeah.
Okay, and photograph D, which direction is that looking?
Again, it's a close-up, and you're closer up to this area, looking, again, towards the top of this.
Okay. Okay, you can resume your seat. Thank you, detectives. Thank you, sir. Now, when you went out to the scene, did you actually, we can turn the lights back up, thank you. When you went out to the scene, what was your role there? I assume you weren't the only detective there.
I was a secondary detective at the scene to assist.
Okay, and so what were you assisting with?
Various things. When I first got to the scene, I was asked to check a mobile home park that was just north of the scene that was abandoned, and they asked me to go in there and search for any signs of a crime scene or clothing.
And did you see anything?
No, I did not.
Okay, were all those trailers empty?
Yeah.
Okay. We heard testimony, I think they were in the process of being demolished, is that right?
Yes, they were being demolished. There was a construction worker there.
Okay. Anything else
Well,
with regard to the scene? Sorry.
No, when I returned from doing that, I was asked to go up to a local precinct to copy Snohomish County's file
Okay.
and bring it back to the scene, so I did that.
Okay. Did you actually approach Nicole's body?
In those pictures where that group was, I probably got that close.
Okay. So you weren't right on top of
No.
it? Okay. But if you had a chance to, well, let me ask you first. On the major crimes unit at that time, was there a dedicated detective to videotape crime scenes?
There are several that we use, yes.
Okay. And what is the point of that?
Once again, just to get an accurate representation of the scene.
Okay. And are they used to videotape other things as well, searches or anything like that?
Major cases, typically we use them on only homicides, but if there's something really significant, we would call them.
Okay. And in this case, when Nicole's car was recovered, was the search of that taped as well?
Yes.
Have you had a chance to review part of the videotape from the crime scene to show the overview so we can get a sense of what it looked like in this
Yes.
case?
Yes, I did.
And does it appear to you to be an accurate depiction of what the crime scene looked like in terms of the topography and the layout of the area?
Yes, it did.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Or, upper officially safely. I'm going to have you step down and sort of narrate as we go. And I'll have you just stand where I am when I move here. Okay. We get the lights over here. Sorry. Thank you. Okay. Off to the side, if you would. Okay. It will be shortly. Yes, it is.
When they take videotape of a scene, they usually start at the nearest major intersection and work from there to where the actual scene is. So what you saw there was their street signs for Des Moines Memorial Drive and South 144th Street, and the scene was just west from there. So there he's taking a panoramic view from that intersection. Right now you're looking north, and as you pan over, you're going to be looking west to where the scene is.
So how far is the scene itself from where we're looking at right now about?
Oh, it's still a good block and a half.
And is he zooming in on that
He's
now?
zooming in for the next reference point.
Okay.
So he zoomed up on that street sign, so now he's moved to that location, and once again, he'll take a little panoramic view of it. So there again, there's,
You see a patrol car?
yeah. This is the scene, so now we're at that intersection with South 144 Way, and patrol cars there, and now we'll do the panoramic.
And what's the yellow tape there?
That's the crime scene tape. It's what they established to keep people from entering the, outer limits of the crime scene.
Is this another view of the entry to the area?
Yeah, it looks like it's another shot from, oh no, that's okay, that was looking, you started east and now you look south and now you're panning back to the west of the crime scene again.
Okay.
We just flipped the camera around there.
So it's just showing the different ways that you can
Yes.
get in there.
Yeah, South 144th Street is, or Way is another road that has access to this area.
Now that shot, is that looking out from?
This is, yes, this is looking for more of the cul-de-sac area and you're starting looking east and once again we're panning south. And we're not quite to the cul-de-sac, because here's the cul-de-sac right back in there. And her body was found right beyond those people. That's the trailer park I mentioned that was being partially destroyed. And we're panning north, we're coming back around.
So basically it's turning a circle within
Yes.
the cul-de-sac.
Yep. And then we're back to where her body was located. Now we can continue circling. And once again, we're starting again, looking south, and he's making another circle to the east now.
So he gets a 360
Yes.
basically.
And they're looking back out that intersection is where Des Moines Memorial Drive is. The traffic light out there. I think we're up to 720 now.
Okay. I'll go a little further.
And looking back south again. This looks like probably closer to where the reference point for the MAR diagram was used.
That's the little dot in the middle
A little
of the
dot in the middle
cul-de-sac.
of the intersection. I don't know if it's exact, but it's close to where it is.
Okay.
Now we're going the opposite way now. Now we're looking in a westerly direction.
It's very thorough.
Yes, it was very good job. I was again looking, starting north, now he's swimming back to the west.
Now we're looking at the entryway into the wooded area. Can you describe the overgrowth there
Just
generally?
little trees, blackberries, brush. This looks like a closer view to the entryway into the wooded area. Her body was found right there, of those flags. Looks like he's moving down the trail where her body was located.
Okay. You can resume your seat. So is the videographer one of the first people to be allowed to approach the body in a homicide?
One of the first few people, yes.
And why is that?
So nothing is disturbing.
So what he's photographing is the way that it looked?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. If I could have just a moment. Recognizing that that detective is one of the first to approach, we saw a couple of flags by the body.
Sorry, we can't hear Ms. Richardson.
Sorry. Recognizing that the videographer is one of the first to approach, we saw a couple flags in that area. What are those from?
I would assume it's from one of the first two detectives that were there on scene that was marking evidence of some type.
Okay. Thank you. I have nothing further.
Your Honor.
Sergeant McNabb, one of the things you did very early in the investigation was take a look at some records provided by Singular related to cell towers. Is that correct? Your Honor, it is beyond the scope.
Do you want him to recall him?
Yes, we'll be presenting evidence of cell tower records. I think it's not appropriate until then. It's assuming facts, not on evidence at this point.
Counsel, technically she's correct. If you wish to get into the cell phone issue, you can certainly recall him in your case or cross-examine the cell phone people in their case.
So, okay. So Your Honor's saying that
It's beyond the scope. It's something, if you want to get into, you can do it in your case in chief or do it later when it is cross-examination.
okay. If I may have a moment then, Your Honor. Okay, Your Honor, we don't have any questions then on cross-examination. We ask that he remain under subpoena.
He's under subpoena. If you wish to have him recall in your case,
Okay.
Officer Kathy Decker.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that your testimony in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Be seated.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you state your name and spell your last name, please?
Yes, Kathleen Decker, D-E-C-K-E-R.
And what is your current occupation?
I'm an employee of the King County Sheriff's Office, assigned as a police officer to a contract city, which is the city of Newcastle.
The city of what?
Newcastle.
Okay. And what does that mean when you're assigned as a contract deputy?
Essentially, what that means is I have a different title. I'm not a deputy title. I'm an officer, since I'm assigned to a city department. The city of Newcastle is one of several contracts with the sheriff's office, and they contract out with the county sheriff to provide police services to their city. And so I'm one of 6 officers that work there.
How long have you been with the King County Sheriff's Office?
October 1st will be 28 years.
What are the different positions, if you can briefly just indicate, that you've held with the King County Sheriff's Office?
Well, I began, like everybody does, working patrol, and I worked what then was the unincorporated area of Federal Way, which of course now is a city with their own police department. I spent approximately 6 years working as a patrol deputy, had about 6 months of that time where I was able to perform as a master police officer, which is a corporal rating. Then I was fortunate enough to be considered and selected as a detective in what is the Special Assault Unit, where I was assigned to investigate cases of physical and sexual assault against children and adults. I did that for 2 years. Then there was an opening in the King County Major Crime Unit, and I applied for and was selected to be a detective in that unit, where I investigated homicides, robberies, missing person cases, assault cases. I did that for 13 and a half years, and then in 2006 I decided to try a different position, doing something completely out of my norm, and I applied for the position of the Search and Rescue Coordinator for King County Sheriff, and I was selected for that position, where I managed upwards of 400 emergency worker volunteers, as well as working with upwards of 8 to 10 King County Sheriff's search and rescue duty officers. And we were assigned to respond to all searches and rescues and body recoveries within King County, Alpine Wilderness area being the primary spot where we spent most of our time. And then in 2012, or 2011, I think it was, I decided I needed a little bit of a break from being on call 24/7, and I applied for a position in the city of Newcastle and was selected for that position, and that's where I am currently.
I want to focus and ask you a few more questions about a couple of the jobs. The first is when you were with the Major Crimes Unit. Were you with the Major Crimes Unit in February of 2006?
Yes, I was.
We've heard a little testimony about that unit, but it was part of your job to investigate homicides, murder scenes.
Yes, that's correct.
And any idea how many murder or homicide scenes you might have responded to during your time with the Major Crimes Unit?
13 years worth, I couldn't even begin to guess. We averaged, I believe, 20 to 21 murders annually, and I probably was involved in half of those. So, and then that doesn't count the scenes that I was called to respond to that were outside the county. So I'd say somewhere maybe around 100.
And I want to talk just briefly about your time with the Search and Rescue Unit. When you were doing that job and overseeing all those people, can you just describe kind of what that job entailed in terms of what you were usually doing as part of that job?
Yes. As the coordinator, it was my job to locate resources and to establish for them a meeting point or gathering point, and to ensure that the search or rescue operation was going without difficulty, and that the volunteers were going to be in a relatively safe environment, at least as safe as we could possibly make it. My job was to oftentimes brief the volunteers as to what the objectives were in the search, and to ensure that they had all the tools and necessary clothing and equipment that they might need in order to be able to perform the job at hand. For King County, oftentimes we receive the rescue calls. That's probably the most
frequent type of call where somebody has been out hiking or climbing in the alpine wilderness area of our county and gets into difficulty, either injures or hurts himself, or falls, or simply just gets lost and needs some assistance in getting out of wherever it is they've gotten themselves into.
So in that job, when you would go out searching or rescuing people, am I correct, was that, you were almost always outdoors, is that fair to say?
Yes, that is very fair to say. All the evidence recovery scenes that we went on in search and rescue, which was to support and supplement what the King County Sheriff detectives were doing at a crime scene. We helped them look for evidence that was disposed of, discarded, were outdoor scenes, and of course, anytime we were up in the wooded areas looking for folks that were lost or hurt.
Now, I want to direct you to this case for a moment. Were you part of the major crimes unit during the Nicole Pietz homicide investigation?
Yes.
And were you called to respond to where her body was located?
Yes, I was.
And do you recall what date that was?
It was February 6th of 2006.
And was that response in King County?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And what was your role? Were you dispatched by your sergeant to go out there?
Yes, I received a phone call from the sergeant at that time, who was Sergeant D.B. Gates, and she requested my response to that scene to assist in the investigation.
And were you among other detectives who also responded to that scene?
Yes.
Was anybody assigned as a particular lead or lead position at that response?
Yes, there always is somebody who's assigned that role, and in this particular case, it was Detective Jesse Anderson.
And when you got there, were you assigned a particular task?
Yes, I was assigned a particular task. My assignment to start was to search and look around that particular area for any evidence of human footfall, of human movement, which is a specialty skill that I've developed over the years.
And I want to get into that in a moment. I want to just ask, how many, we talked about sort of how many different homicide scenes you responded to. Do you know, or are you able to put a number on how many times you responded to a homicide scene where the body was outdoors?
I couldn't even begin. At least half of the scenes were probably outdoor scenes. We don't categorize them that way, so it's hard for me to go back mentally and try to visualize or picture those scenes, but a good number of them were outdoor scenes.
I want to talk now about what you just mentioned, which is that you have sort of a specialized training as well in something you call tracking.
Yes, that's correct.
What does that mean, tracking?
Tracking in the context as it relates to the organization that I train with involves looking and searching for what we call sign evidence. Sign is S-I-G-N, just the common word as you might know it. The definition of that word is the discoverable physical evidence of the presence or passage of a person. So simply put, what we're looking for is evidence of where people have been and understanding and interpreting what that might mean as it relates to a particular investigation.
And so, I think you mentioned, were you all asked to do that at this particular scene where Nicole Pietz's body was found?
Yes, I was.
And is that something at that point, I mean, how far along were you in being a tracker? Had you been training for a long time at that point?
I began learning about the art and skill of tracking in 1998. So this was 2006. So I had just 2 years earlier received a certification as a journeyman tracker.
And that means what, a highest level of tracker?
Second to the highest level of tracker. But I was fairly new to that certification level. But what that means is that I had a very basic understanding of knowledge of sign evidence, how to begin a tracking operation, what a footprint would look like under different types of conditions with different weathering effects. And I had some training and understanding in how to work that with other types of resources, and in this case it was detectives who would be doing an investigation along with the tracking.
So I want to talk more about the training in a moment, but first I want to ask, at this particular scene, the Nicole Pietz scene, what types of things did you think you might be able to determine as a tracker responding to this scene?
Well, anytime you have a scene such as this, where we had a very unfortunate case of a woman whose body had been deposited in an area of some blackberry bushes, we know that in order for her to get where she was found, her resting place, there had to have been some human movement involved. Either her alive to get herself there, or someone who is taking or carrying her there. And depending upon what information we had available at the time, would give us a little bit more direction as to what would likely be what we will find when we're out searching for the sign evidence. So in this case, we know that she was deceased. We didn't have a really good idea how long she had been there, but we certainly had a reason to think that she may have been brought there by somebody else or carried to that location. So my job was to look and search for any evidence that might be consistent with that theory.
And is part of what you learn in your tracking training that you're able to do sometimes is also be able to determine timing, meaning perhaps how long a body may or may not have been at a location?
Yes, sometimes we can do that with some exactness, and other times it's more of a general statement or opinion that we're able to give based upon what we refer to as aging factors. And aging factors are essentially what you would ascertain from studying and examining the vegetation that's around whatever the object is, in this case a human body. And we look at the vegetation around her body as well as any vegetation that has been stepped upon or crushed just by the human footfall, the regular movement of a person who's walking through the woods. And there's an aging process that happens that we train to that gives us some idea of how long a person has been there or how long it has been since a person has passed through a particular area.
Now, we're talking about tracking in the case of situations like this body scene. Is it something that you also could use in your search and rescue job to literally locate somebody who's missing?
Yes, and in fact, tracking is an art that has been around for hundreds of years. The King County Search and Rescue Organization does have a tracking unit, and their specific objective is to utilize this skill and application to search for persons that have gone missing. The law enforcement application of it, although it certainly can be and has been used for that, is also used for better understanding and interpreting the evidence at a crime scene to gain more information about how many people were there, who was doing what, maybe some of what the mental state was of the individuals that were there, depending upon how much information it is that we have at hand.
I want to talk a little bit about how you learned to become a tracker and reach that journeyman level so that the jury can understand a little more about why you're able to do what you do. First of all, you began in 1998. And is there a particular organization or place where you got this training?
Yes, there's several different tracking organizations throughout the country. The one that I have chosen to affiliate with is called Joel Harden Professional Tracking Services. Joel Harden is the proprietor of that training organization, and he still is today. He's a retired Border Patrol officer who had over 30 years of tracking training expertise he gained through Border Patrol at the southern border in California. He was tracking individuals who were illegally crossing over the border. And upon his retirement, he took it upon himself to continue teaching those that were interested in this skill, primarily search and rescue, and also as he progressed, law enforcement and eventually military who were interested in learning this application and this skill. And so in 1998, I was invited to attend a lecture by Joel. I was in the major crime unit at the time. I attended the lecture, and I walked out of that lecture completely amazed at how much information I was potentially not seeing and understanding at my crime scenes because I didn't even know to look for it. I've been trained to look for fingerprint evidence. I've been trained to understand and look for blood evidence, but never had I had any training about footprint evidence. And so I decided at that point that I was going to learn a little bit more about this and hopefully be able to apply it to my investigations in the major crime unit.
Now, so do you attend classes in a classroom? Did you go out in the field? I mean, how were you learning this skill over the years?
Both. So when you first start tracking, it's classroom. There's lecture because there's some important information that needs to be shared with students about the history of the program, the information as to how to appropriately use one of the tools that we use when we're tracking called a tracking stick that you use when you're essentially first starting out and can continue to use throughout the duration of the training. So a good part of it is lecture, and then from that point on, we move to an outdoor environment and we begin training with different teams, and the teams that we trained with would consist of a mix of law enforcement, search and rescue, and military, depending upon who the students were in that particular class. And then the trainers or instructors would be individuals that have an extensive history in doing and practicing the skill, and have knowledge of what tracking is, as well as operational experience. And so we begin to train repetitively over time, looking at footprints that were laid and made at various time frames in various types of vegetation and in various types of weather conditions. And we start to learn and categorize in our minds what that information is going to look like as it translates into an actual crime scene.
So Officer Decker, if I wanted to learn to be a tracker, I mean, would somebody make a track, go somewhere at a certain time, and then I might be, as a student, brought in to figure out, with nobody telling me, whether someone had walked through there, when they might have walked through there? I mean, is that the kind of thing that you would do in your training?
Yes, in part. When we're first learning, what would happen, the instructor would go, and we call it laying a line of sign, which essentially the instructor would go purposely walk in a relatively straight line from a starting point that was well defined. So you would have 2 footprints to start with that were easily identifiable and recognizable as footprints. And then that instructor would walk from that point out into the woods or through the grassy field where the training environment would be. That sign line would be date stamped, time and date when it was made. And so the student had a baseline of when that was made, generally 30 hours prior to the beginning of class. And then as the student worked through following step by step over periods of hours for a 24-hour training, they would begin to understand the aging effects of what happens with various weather conditions in that type of vegetation. And we do that repetitively over and over again. As we advance and begin to understand more and more of what the sign looks like, then we introduce different types of exercises, perhaps some scenarios that would replicate what we might find in a crime scene. We also add some other more complicated scenarios where you might introduce additional tracking teams. So you might be working with 3 or 4 different teams of 3, and you would have to then, as a team coordinator, understand and know how to place those teams out in the field so that you would be using all the members to the best of their abilities to get the evidence that was going to be most important to that investigation.
So let me just go back for a moment. So initially, when you're learning, when the sign is left or the footprints are left, any kind of indication someone's been somewhere, you get told when it was left so that you get to know what it's going to look like in a certain area after a certain passage of time. So you just get to learn that first knowing?
Yes, we spend many, many hours, thousands of hours learning. Yes.
And eventually, do you progress to the point where you don't get told when it was left and you're sort of tested? You have to go out and determine where the sign is and when that happened.
Yes, that's correct. And the instructor who laid the sign knows when he or she laid it. And so after we've completed that exercise or that assignment, we would report back, explain what we saw, why we believe what we believe, and then we would be told whether we were correct or not correct. And if we were incorrect, then the instructor would continue to work with us and show us what it was that we missed or help us to better understand what it was that was happening with the weather, so we would know why it was that we were incorrect.
So let me ask, did you train in all different types of settings, meaning dry vegetation, wet vegetation, different types of areas of the country, such that you get to learn the way time might affect areas that are different? Like you might do a wooded area, or you might do more of a desert area. Is that something that you would do?
Yes. Part of this program, as you progress upwards in the program and develop your skill, there's an expectation that you are going to travel and track in different types of areas. So I've been to Colorado, I've been to Kansas, I've been to the East Coast repetitively several times a year. I've tracked in blizzards, I've tracked in rain, I've tracked in 100-degree heat, high humidity, low humidity, so I've had an opportunity to kind of experience the extremes at all ends. Because the reality is, when we're at a crime scene, we have obviously no control over the weather. The weather is going to do what the weather does. And so our hope is that by introducing us to all those different weather effects and different types of ground covers, that we'll have a much better understanding of what it is that we're seeing.
Let me ask just briefly, how many hours of training you think you've had in tracking from when you started to now?
Several thousand.
And do you get, through this training that we're just talking about, going to different areas, have you become very familiar with how different types of leaves, trees, other types of outdoor scenes react, first just over the passage of time?
Yes.
So do you become familiar with what a particular type of leaf might look like one day versus 7 days later based on certain types of weather?
Yes.
And that's probably a very complicated question, but
Yes.
let me branch into the weather issue. Is weather, is knowledge of weather important to a tracker?
Yes.
In what way is that important in what you do?
Well, much of what we do, almost all that we do, is essentially common sense. It's not, you don't have to be a botanist or a scientist to be able to track. Anybody can learn how to do this. And so weather becomes important is if we know when the rain began, when the dew point was, what the heat index.
Can I just stop you for a second? I'm not
Yes.
sure if everybody knows. I don't. What does dew point mean?
Dew point would be, I'll give you an example. During the summer, you might wake up in the morning and you'll see that there's a lot of moisture that's on the ground. Yet you know that it hasn't rained because it was a clear night. A dew point is simply that point, usually early in the morning hours, where the moisture comes up from the surface of the ground and it forms some pellets on the ground. And that might stay for a few hours, and then usually by 10 o'clock or so in the summertime, that's completely dried and gone. And so looking at that type of information is important to us because we need to try to determine whether somebody walked through a particular area when there was moisture on the ground or when it was dry. And if we're seeing evidence that suggests that it was completely dry at the time somebody walked through, then we could say that that happened, that person made that particular movement before the dew point or before the rain began. And so weather becomes important to us as we try to ascertain that information.
So for example, if you knew it rained for several days and then was dry for several days, are you able to see from the evidence whether things were wet when someone walked on them versus dry from the way the foliage or whatever looks?
Yes, we can often tell by the way the leafy foliage appears, and we can also tell by the sticks and twigs that are on the ground that have been stepped on, whether or not those were waterlogged at the time they were stepped on, which gives them more pliability and flexibility, or whether something was crisp and dry when it was stepped on, which would cause it to break immediately.
So can that help you know, for example, when someone might have walked and dropped a body?
Yes.
You mentioned earlier that there's different levels in the organization that you train with, and you said you're the journeyman. Is that the highest level?
No, sign cutter is the highest level, which is what I'm at now. At the time that I was on this particular scene, I was a journeyman tracker.
And is that the second highest level?
Yes.
And what levels are below that?
Well, let me start at the beginning and
Okay.
work my way up. So when you first are introduced to tracking, you're considered a novice, which all that means is that you're new to this. It's being introduced to you. You don't really have a lot of familiarity with what it is. The first certification level is basic certification, and we define that simply by saying that's when you learn to see sign. You're learning to see a track. Typically, it's approximately about 120 to 140 hours of training time before a student really gets to that level. That being said, everybody is different in their abilities to understand this and to be able to do this particular type of skill. So some people might progress a little bit quicker if they're going to a lot of trainings in a short period of time versus an individual who's only able to go to 1 or 2 trainings a year would unfortunately be in a position where they're having to kind of relearn a little bit of what they had learned 6 months earlier. So it really does depend upon the individual and their abilities to be involved in a training environment. And then the basic certification is the apprentice certification, and that's another probably 500 hours or so thereabouts. I'm giving an approximate. And that's when you're learning more about different types of tactics and techniques that help you to hopefully have a higher probability of finding this type of evidence. So you learn how to better work with multiple teams. We work in teams of 3, ideally. We don't, as we will talk about, always have the ability to have other trackers with us, so sometimes we have to work on our own. But ideally, a team of 3, and so as an apprentice tracker, there might be tasked with having to work with multiple teams, learning how to do what we call sign cutting, which is using natural man-made barriers to help you identify the highest probability of the route a person may have taken. And then there's the journeyman certification level, which is usually about, well, I think I had 1,000 hours by that point when I was certified. And that's an even more complex level where now we might be expecting you to run a fairly complex operation, a tracking operation with multiple resources over periods of days perhaps. And you are also at that point expected to be instructing with the program and carrying more of the administrative workload. Then the top level, which is Master Tracker, essentially is the honing in of all the skills. You never ever learn everything there is to know about tracking, so as you progress up to the level where I'm at, I now pretty much know what I don't know, whereas I didn't even know what I didn't know earlier. So you're always learning and better understanding what it is that people do and how we move about. And as a sign cutter, I'm tasked with much more administrative workload, the paperwork that our program requires us to have to document what we're doing, as well as the instructing. So I travel around the country now several times a year, helping search and rescue volunteers and law enforcement personnel in the military understand what this is and showing them what it is that I've learned and how it can be applied.
So in the search and rescue context, you can literally use that skill to find somebody. I mean, to start somewhere and then find where they are.
Yes, trackers unfortunately rarely ever get to make the find, but what trackers do that's so important is they will determine the direction of travel, which is huge. If you have a search operation where you have several thousand acres of wilderness, you have a vehicle parked at a trailhead, and the vehicle is associated to a missing person, the question that the search and rescue coordinator always has is, where do I begin? If you have 5 or 6 different trails that all come to a point at that trailhead, we seldom know where to start sending our resources. So a tracker working from that vehicle would be able to identify the direction of travel and identify what the route was that the person at least initially took, so that when we're putting all the resources out, we're putting them at least in the initial direction that's correct and not sending people out with a much lower probability of success. So the trackers would get it started and start to follow that track step by step, and then the other resources, your air scent, your dog teams, your trailing dogs, the helicopter, the horses, whatever resources you might have are going to be much quicker moving and looking for the subject, but at least they'd be looking in the right direction.
So it's not that you couldn't make the find, it's just that usually other resources take over at that point.
Yes, that's correct.
In the Nicole Pietz scene that you responded to, what was the type of terrain or wilderness that you were dealing with, and you can just describe it?
Sure, very Pacific Northwest. So what we had was a trail that essentially was accessed off of a paved cul-de-sac. And the trail consisted of a lot of leaf litter from alder trees. So the alder trees had shed their leaves, as they do, year after year after year, creating kind of almost a cushion on the ground. There were a lot of twigs on the ground as well, just the typical type of debris you would expect, deadfall from trees and brush. The trail itself was fairly well defined. It was more of a path of least resistance, perhaps, than you might think of it as a trail. But there was a route that you could take into where her body was ultimately found that would be the easiest way to go. In other words, you weren't having to go through blackberry bushes and other types of viney vegetation, which would make your travel difficult. You could walk fairly freely. The trail was approximately 20 yards or so in length, and that's just an approximate. And once you got to the end of this trail, or this route of path of least resistance, if you turned to your right, you would go another 15 feet or so northeasterly, and that's where she was ultimately recovered.
And let me just clarify, and you've sort of said this, but when you say trail, this wasn't like a marked trail that had been made by the government or the city so that someone could go hiking?
Correct. This was a trail likely used by transients or other folk that might be out accessing the woods for whatever reasons they would be accessing the woods.
You described that this area had alder trees that were dropping leaves and lots of twigs and other sort of matter. Were there blackberry vines in this area as well?
It seems like there's always blackberry vines. Yes, there were blackberry vines quite extensively near where her body was.
this type of area where Nicole's body was found, had you done tracking in areas like that before?
Yes, the majority of my tracking, training, and operational tracking experience is from my backyard. And in our backyard, we have a lot of blackberry bushes. And so as a result of that, we set the trainings up to be representative of what we would expect to find in real life. And so yes, I've done a lot of training in and around blackberry bushes.
And when you say in your backyard, you mean the Pacific Northwest?
I mean Pacific Northwest, yes.
Not literally your
my backyard.
So how many hours of training, if you know, do you think you've done around blackberry vines and the effect on human passage through blackberry vines?
I don't know if I can even begin to give an estimate. Hundreds of hours.
Is that similar for the other types of things, the alder trees, leaves that drop from alder trees as well? Is that the same type of thing you encounter in the Northwest a lot?
Yes, alder trees are very prevalent in the Pacific Northwest, as are the maple trees, fir trees. But yes, that's correct.
So have you had experience in observing how those particular things might age over the passage of time in different types of weather conditions?
Yes.
And have you had experience in observing the effect a human passage through an area might have on those specific types of things, blackberry vines, the alder leaves, things like that?
Yes.
In this particular case, when you responded to do your tracking work, did you have a team or were you the only tracker at this particular location?
Unfortunately, I was the only tracker at this particular location.
And you sort of were in double duty. You were also a regular investigating detective for major crimes at
Yes,
this location?
I was literally wearing two hats that day. That's correct.
As part of your work here, was it important for you to know the weather conditions that had occurred leading up to the finding of Nicole's body?
Yes.
And you touched on that briefly, but does that affect your ability to figure out when things happened in that area?
Yes.
So where did you start figuring it? Let me ask you, how do you find out the weather? Do you go look it up? How do you find out what the weather was like? Or is it your own personal observation of what it's been like?
In this particular case, I utilized an online weather site called Weather Underground, and it's a great site for giving us information on weather. Now, we have a lot of microclimates here in the Pacific Northwest, which means that it can be raining at your house, and a mile away it can be sunny and warm. And so we have to take that into effect as well. So we're looking for a general estimate of what the weather was from the closest weather station. And in this case, we were in Burien, and it was very close to Sept Airport, which would be the closest weather station. So it's a fairly good estimate of what the weather was.
So you looked for what the weather had been like according to the SeaTac weather station.
Yes.
And I guess, were you aware when you responded to the scene, or did you become aware that of the date that Nicole Pietz had last been seen?
Yes.
So did you figure out the weather starting from that point, essentially?
Yes.
So what did you determine the weather had been like? So, well, first of all, what date is that you then began determining the weather?
It was January 26th, I believe, which was a Friday.
So did you track the weather from that day all the way up to the point where her body was found?
Yes.
And can you just generally describe what you determined the weather had been like during that time period?
Yes. In fact, if I may refer to my report,
Yeah,
I can actually be more
did you
accurate.
bring your whole
I did.
follow-up? Okay.
Yes.
Does council have any objection if I mark a copy but let her just use the one she's got in her lap? Do you want to look at it, or?
Well, that's fine.
Okay, I'm going to mark a copy for the record, but just a second, Detective, let me just make sure. I want to mark this and have you make sure this is the right thing, and then I'll let you use
Okay.
yours.
Council, can I just see that, make sure I
This is
see?
the one I'm marking. I'll make sure she does. She has an additional one, wouldn't she?
Yes. Your Honor, I have no objection to using this procedure as suggested by counsel.
Detective, and I'm calling you detective because that's what you were then. I guess you're officer now. Can you just make sure that this, what I've marked as Exhibit 34, is indeed the follow-up that I just showed counsel? you need to refer to yours, let me know, and I'm assuming you need to refer to it to talk about the weather.
Yes, to be most accurate.
Why don't you go ahead and do that and indicate what you noted for the weather, or whenever you first noted it, whatever date that was.
And let me correct, I started noting it on January 28th, not on January 26th.
Okay.
Your Honor, since the detective is referring to her report, I'd like to know what page of the report she's referring to, and if you could use that sync number on the top right.
I'm going to do the date and time because her pagination might be slightly different. It's 2/6 of 06 at 14:16, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Okay,
I
thank
believe
you.
it's page 10.
Yes, mine's the same, thank you.
Okay. So why don't you go ahead and indicate what you determined the weather conditions to have been on January 28th, Detective?
Yes, the mean temperature, average temperature was 44 degrees Fahrenheit, and precipitation was at 0.75 inches. So in other words, it rained pretty well that day. January 29th, 46 degrees was the average, 0.73 inches of rain. January 31st, 46 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.33 inches of rain. February 1st, 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.29 inches of rain. February 2nd, 47 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.30 inches of rain. February 3rd, 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.11 inches of rain. February 4th, 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.41 inches of rain. So essentially from January 28th through February 5th, or February 4th, my apologies, it rained. And the temperature was between 46 and 51 degrees average. On February 5th, it was 45 degrees Fahrenheit with no rain. February 6th, the day we were there, shows 45 degrees Fahrenheit as an average with no rain. And I believe I noted as well in my follow-up that it was 50 degrees when I arrived and sunny.
So let me ask you this, officer. So looking at the January calendar exhibit 2, it was wet January 28th, 29th, 30th, and 31st.
And February 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and 4th.
Okay. So continuing on to State's Exhibit 13, continued to rain through the 4th of February.
Yes.
And then it was dry, no precipitation, February 5th and 6th.
Yes, no rain precipitation. Yes.
So when you responded to this area, how would you describe the conditions physically there in terms of wetness?
Well, when we say dry, that means there's nothing coming down from the sky, but the ground was still quite wet from the previous rainfall amounts that had occurred prior to our arrival at the scene that day. So it was still fairly damp on the ground, but we weren't having a situation where we were having deluge of water coming down upon us or anything of that sort.
So I want to ask you, I don't want you to tell me your opinions at this point, but I want to ask if, from your examination at this scene as a tracker, were you able to form an opinion as to approximately how long you believed Nicole Pietz's body had been at that location?
Yes.
And were you able to be exact to the day, or is there a little bit of variation in what your opinion ultimately was as to the day? Again, you don't have to give the opinion yet, but just be able to say this many days, or is it more of a range?
It was a range.
And were you able to form an opinion in this situation, again, without giving it to me yet, as to whether you could tell from your tracking whether this body had been thrown or dumped as opposed to just placed down in that location?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'm going to pull up a bunch of photos now. Would you like to take the break before we get into that?
Why don't we do that?
Okay.
Since you're gonna take some time to do it. Good morning, what you said?